Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Okay, hello everybody and welcome. My name is Tamar Kodish. I'm a clinical psychologist and an assistant professor here at the University of Colorado Boulder in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience. Today is Wednesday, April 9th, 2025. It's 3:30 p.m. and this is panel number 18134. Before we get started today, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, faculty, and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success and integrating Indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. One other thing I'd like to mention before we get started today is that we want to be sure that you get a chance to ask questions. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we'll handle the Q&A. We're going to reserve the end of the discussion for the Q&A, and we're using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. So at any time during the session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and a pencil from one of our producers. And please write legibly on your note card so that we can read your important questions. If you're a student, please note this on your question in the card. And when you finish, raise your hand and you'll hand your note card off to a producer who will bring it up to me. And I would urge everybody to just please make your questions brief and to the point. I'm really excited and honored to be here today as the panel moderator, and we have an incredibly bright and passionate group of panelists who have professional and personal expertise in the science and treatment of addiction. We know that there are so many different temptations that we're all facing today, from social media to gambling to drugs and alcohol, and so I'm really looking forward to a discussion that will, I think, really enrich our understanding of these topics and ultimately help us learn how to care for ourselves and our loved ones who might be facing challenges related to temptation and to addiction. So the next thing I'm going to do is introduce each of our really remarkable panelists. And there's more information about each of them on the CWA website. So Trina Faatz is the opioid outreach navigator for Boulder County Public Health and is an affected family member for the Boulder County Public Health Substance Use Advisory Group, which is a shared leadership coalition of over 300 members in Boulder County whose mission is to destigmatize substance use and prevent fatal overdoses. Trina is a passionate community advocate and works on legislative issues in Colorado on the opioid epidemic, regulating marijuana and behavioral health. Trina and her daughter present in local high schools across the state about fentanyl, the stages of addiction, brain chemistry, and Narcan training. And together they've educated over 4,000 students and families in Colorado. Our next panelist is Laura Marciano. Dr. Marciano is a research associate at the Lee Kam-Sheung Center for Health and Happiness at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She leads research on digital media and well-being, including the Happy Bee projects funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. Her work explores the impact of smartphone and social media use on teen well-being using innovative methods like trace data and digital biomarkers. Judy Grisel is an internationally recognized behavioral neuroscience and neuroscientist and professor of psychology at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania. After overcoming addiction herself in her 20s, she pursued a PhD in behavioral neuroscience at the University of Colorado Boulder and completed postdoctoral work in behavioral genetics at Oregon Health and Science University. Her research explores the neural mechanisms underlying addiction and the impact of sex differences on substance use disorders. Dr. Grisel is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Never Enough, The Neuroscience and Experience of Addiction, which is now translated into over a dozen languages. And our last final panelist is Dr. Danielle Dick, who is an endowed professor of psychiatry, psychology, and genetics at Rutgers University. She is a globally recognized expert on genetics and environmental influences on human behavior, with over 450 peer-reviewed publications on child development, addiction, mental health, and behavioral genetics. Dr. Dick has received over $55 million in funding and is one of the most highly cited researchers in the world. And she's received numerous awards, both national and international, for her contributions to science. So I'm sure you will all agree that we have a really remarkable panel here with just an incredible wealth of expertise. And at this point, I'll turn it over to each of you to share a little bit with us about what drew you to this topic and some introductory remarks about the topic of the day. Yeah?
Thank you so much. I'm Trina Faatz, and I want to make a slight correction. I no longer facilitate the Substance Use Advisory Group for Boulder County Public Health, but I facilitated that coalition for 7 years. We grew it to the largest shared leadership coalition in the state of Colorado, dealing with substance use and substance use prevention and treatment. Involved in this coalition, and it is still mighty and very strong, and anyone is invited to it. We have law enforcement, our DA's office, our sheriff drug task force, we have the hospitals, we have the school districts, we have treatment programs, outpatient and inpatient. We have medicated assisted treatment programs. We have affected community members. We have persons in recovery. And we have our really infamous and wonderful harm reduction program, The Works. And I've probably missed a number of other organizations. I got into this work because my own daughter, while in public school in Boulder, was overprescribed opioids and then became addicted. I was uneducated and uninformed about opioids at the time, and she grew addicted to opioids and then became a heroin user very quickly, found heroin within Boulder High schools. That heroin turned from a smoking addiction to an IV use, and believe it or not, by the time that addiction grew to its height, my daughter was injecting heroin at age 17, 5 to 6 times a day. That was not to get high. That was to stay alive. That was to keep her brain functioning and to keep her from going into withdrawals. Anyone who's gone into withdrawals will tell you they would rather die than go through that. Fortunately, my daughter's on the other side. She's an addiction counselor. She's 27 years old. We have a program. We go into all of the high schools in Boulder Valley School District. We speak in the health classes and the teen life school classes. We talk about fentanyl, counterfeit pills, overdose, addiction. We do an evidence-based brain chemistry presentation for the students. We train them in Narcan, and we have met with over 4,000 students in the last 6 years. So that's where I am, and that's how I got here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so thank you for the nice introduction. My interest in the topic of, I would say, digital addictions, although today we use the term problematic digital media usages. There is a lot of debate on is it an addiction or not using internet and social media, a lot of scientific debate, but it's coming more from my studies. So when I was studying neuroscience, can you hear me? No, okay, so yeah, my interest in the topic of digital addictions is coming from my studies. When I was studying neuroscience and psychology in Italy, I was very fascinated about how the brain works and how our behavior can be explained by the biology, even some extreme behaviors. But then when I started my PhD that was focused on the use of technologies, I realized that nobody during my studies was talking about what we call today behavioral addictions that are going from gambling, and now we have internet addiction, social media problematic usage, and so. And so that was my way to kind of bridge, I feel the gap and create this bridge among different disciplines because nobody was really like teaching that at the university at that time. So yeah, and meantime I was also very passionate about personalities and how different people and different personality traits can develop or not some addictive behavior in the context of digital technologies and especially with the focus on youth. And so this is why like part of my work has been focused on that.
Hi, everybody. Thanks. Thanks for the introduction. I probably got dopamine involved, shortly after birth. I think I have always been a kind of an appetitive person, full of appetites for everything I could get. I think my parents would say I was kind of a pain that way, but I have a tendency to want more all the time, and that was not a bad thing in a young girl. But when I discovered alcohol first and then other drugs shortly after my 12th birthday, it became not so great. So I ended up mostly using cocaine and alcohol and marijuana all during my teen years, and as a result of that, I was kicked out of 3 schools and eventually became homeless and contracted hepatitis C, and mostly really hated myself and my life. And I was kind of in the position of Trina's daughter, that I was using not to feel good, but just not to feel bad, and life was bleak without it. And I ended up in treatment. This was in the 1980s. I thought that treatment was going to be like a spa. I don't know. I didn't know what treatment was. Somehow I was pretty clueless, and also it was a while ago. And so I thought, I deserve a break. I've had a tough time here. So yeah, send me to treatment. And then when I saw the nurses' uniforms and things, it wasn't so fun. But I learned there that I was suffering from a disease, a mental illness, and that if I wanted to live, I would need to make some big changes, including abstinence. And I thought, no way. I thought I had a lot of problems, which is why I went to the spa, but that drugs and alcohol were the solution. So my crazy thinking said, well, if I have a disease, you're telling me, and I can't use, diseases can be cured. So I'm going to fix my disease and be able to use without self-destructing, which was completely harebrained, right? I had a GPA of about 1.6, and but I did have the kind of determination and motivation and the appetitiveness that has served me well since getting sober in 1986. And I somehow got into grad school here. It took me 7 years to get my undergrad. I was here for quite a while. I learned a ton about addiction during this time, and then my postdoc, and then as an assistant professor, and promoted up the ranks. And I was studying, really I was interested in what's different about my brain than, say, my brothers or other people who don't overdo it, who maybe get a prescription for a drug and then, think, well, that's not good for me. And I learned a lot about that. I don't think I've solved it at all, and neither, I don't think, maybe Danielle, but nobody but Danielle have either solved it. But I do think we understand a lot about the differences that people come to the table with. And I will say this last thing. I think that the very same traits that made me such a desperate drug addict are the traits that have made me a good scientist, a good community member, somebody who would be so bold as to write a book, and end up here. So that's all I have.
Well, it's such, pull this out here. Well, it is such a joy to be here with you all today. How I ended up in this area is a bit different, and I'll start with a confession, which is that when I was applying and looking around at various graduate schools, I said to my mentor, I love this particular program, and I think this is where I want to go, except the person I would work with studies addiction. And I'm not interested in addiction. I thought at that point I wanted to study severe mental illness, schizophrenia I was working on at that point in time. And he said, this is a great person, it's a great program. Go, you'll get great training, and then you can apply it to whatever you want. And of course, fast forward 20 plus years, and now I have the great honor of running what's the largest addiction research center in the country, and with about 150 researchers who span everything from basic neuroscience all the way through to treatment and policy. And of course, the reason I have ended up in this field for so many years now is because as soon as you start learning about both substance use disorders and now behavioral addictions, you realize how many people are affected, how we are so far behind in this area compared to so many other areas of medicine. And so we have real opportunity to make an impact. And maybe like Judy, I also was always someone who liked a good challenge. And it's hard to think of a disorder or a societal, circumstance right now like we find ourselves in that's more challenging than understanding addiction, where we know genes play a role, the environment plays a role across multiple levels, families, schools, neighborhoods, policy. And so I thought this is an area where I might be able to make a difference. And so I'm excited to be up here with these folks and talk about it today.
Thank you all so much. So that's actually a perfect segue into my first question, which is around if you think about all those different sort of levels of factors that we know play into addiction, what from your perspective, from your research, from your experience, are the biggest risk factors for addiction?
I think there's three, so three main bins. The half of the risk is genetic, and Danielle can go a lot about that. Half is environmental, but I would divide that environmental piece into things that happen early in development, before your brain is mature, so let's say 25 or 26, so developmental environmental factors, and other environmental factors. And in both cases, stress and access are major influences. But maybe you want to add.
So I was always a firm believer that it was genetics as well, and then my daughter was tested for all the genetics that supposedly are inherent in addiction, and she didn't have any of them. And her psychiatrist said that she was probably the worst addict he had ever worked with. So then I kind of lost faith in the genetic school of thought. I know there is a school of thought by Dr. Gabor Mate, if you've heard of Dr. Mate. He's world-renowned, and that is trauma. I was very confused because my daughter didn't have trauma. She grew up in a loving, wonderful home in Boulder, Colorado. But then I realized that trauma is how we process any threat, an emotional or physical threat to our well-being. And that really helped me understand that trauma can be many different things, and it has to do with how the soul can process that. So that is one very strong belief, and that might fit in with environmental factors as well.
Yeah, maybe I can just add briefly, because then I think Danielle...
Go close, she can't hear you.
Okay. I think, Danielle, you can add even more from the scientific perspective. There is one factor that when it comes to like digital addictions, I think it's, if we can call in that way, because as I say, there is quite a huge debate around that, but how do we cope with our emotions? So at some point there was a paper saying, in order to be internet addiction, internet shouldn't be used to cope with negative emotions, which I don't think is true. Like, actually, when we look at the data, I think the number one reason why people are spending so much time online is to cope with something negative that is going on. We know it's true for other kind of addictions, but when it comes to behavioral addictions and spending time online, that is very important. So besides of all the genetics and environmental factors, I really think that today the environment is offering us so many ways to cope with our emotions because of business models, because of the power of having your attention and just spending time on something, because we can access to tools in a way that is very quick. So we think that we can just quickly fix our emotions in that way and fix us and not being sad because we just start scrolling again on social media or whatever. So I really think that thinking more truly about the role of coping and emotional regulations, especially today in adolescence, is very crucial, because I feel something is changing.
So I agree with everything that's been said before, in the sense that we know that both genes and environment are important in why some people are more at risk than others. And asking, is it genetic or is it environmental, as even some doctors and whatnot will do, because there's a lot of misunderstanding. That's kind of like saying, is the area of a rectangle due to the length or due to the width? It's always both. You can't get to area without it being both. And the way that we talk about it sometimes in psychiatry is we all have a mental health jar. And so if you imagine one of those clear mason jars, and when that jar is full, that's when someone is actively experiencing problems. And so what can make that jar full? Well, first, genetic risk. And so if you imagine, we are all born with some marbles in our jar, and some people have low genetic risk, they just have a few marbles, and some people have jars that are 3/4 of the way full already. And then what you add are environmental factors, so the kinds of things that Judy and Trina and Laura were talking about, stressors, life traumas, using to cope, other sorts of things. So it's always genes and environment, but how much for each individual it's due to their genes and their environment will vary. We all have our own unique jar. And I'll just, Trina opened the door to something that I think is so important when she was saying that her daughter was tested for genetic factors. So we have learned a ton about genetic risk over the last few decades. And I can tell you that if anyone is giving you a genetic test for any type of substance use or mental health challenge that is just a few candidate genes, which is most of what's out there, it does not represent the state of the science. So what we know is that there's actually thousands of genetic variants. And in fact, the FDA just approved a genetic test for opioid use disorder that was developed purely commercially. And I'm happy to go into the details if someone's interested, but the scientific community all of a sudden paid attention and went, that's based on science that was decades old and actually has been debunked. And when we try and replicate these genes as associated with opioid use disorder, it turns out what they do is they pick out race and ethnicity really well, but they don't at all predict substance use problems. And so I'm really glad Trina raised this, because unfortunately it's very difficult to know right now, as there's a lot of genetic testing has become hot and you see these things commercially available, what represents state of the science and what doesn't, because even FDA approval does not necessarily mean it's state of the science. And so So I just want to mention that unfortunately that's led to more confusion about, do I have the gene for fill in the blank, because you can find genetic tests online for, do I have the gene for depression or anxiety or alcoholism or whatever it might be, opioid use disorder. And most of they all have wonderful websites and they say they're evidence-based and represent the latest science, and the vast majority of them do not.
Thanks, everyone. I think just really highlighting how complex this is, right? And that there's not just one thing or one factor that we see really as a primary or a main risk factor. On the flip side, can you speak to what are some of the biggest protective factors or the buffers against addiction that we know about from the research or from your experience?
I don't want to be a pig here, but there's never enough. I think one of the, there's literature on this too, and some of it is, it's mostly correlational. So you'll hear that eating dinner with your family every night protects you. It's probably not the dinner so much as it is what that reflects, that parents are not at work, that there's maybe more economic stability and housing stability. Being part of groups, religious groups, sports teams. I think, though, that if we really were good at identifying the things that would protect kids and adults from developing problems, then we wouldn't have so many problems. So we're not really great at that. I think that what helped me the most was getting access to good treatment really early when I was young. And even though I was not a very agreeable case, I think I was in a sort of a prime brain state to learn new things. And I think that helped. I also think it helped me, excuse me, to be able to go to college and learn new things. I think if someone had said to me, don't use drugs, Judy, and here's your job at, the local Taco Bell or something, not that people don't need to work, everywhere, but I think it would have been much harder for me. I think the fact that I had something interesting and worthwhile to do, you could say that people like me are really tuned in for worthwhile things, and drugs are inherently, to the brain anyway, worthwhile. That's why they're addictive drugs. So other worthwhile things are really helpful. And I'll just say, I guess what I'm in a nutshell trying to say is that I don't think it helps to say don't do them, or to even give a lot of information so much about not doing them. I do think it helps to say, do these other things that are maybe more engaging ultimately, more rewarding ultimately, more challenging, more developmentally appropriate.
Yeah, so maybe I can add from the perspective of digital technologies and young people, what I found in research, well, obviously we have some personality traits that can be protective, but if we think at the context, the family environment is really important. And I say that because the young people who develop digital addictions and just go into internet to avoid emotions and avoid family conflicts, they are the ones that have, more conflicts at home, and also they have parents that already have higher levels of problematic digital media usage. So the two correlate with each other, right? And we have found in research that when there is a climate in the family that can boost empathy and understanding and communication in a way that the child is self-disclosing, per se, the information without being forced to disclose that, but there is that kind of, warmth in the family that allows to open up about the problems, about the issues, so then the parent can be there saying, you can do this other thing. You don't have to go in your room and just stay focused on the screen to avoid the emotions. So the family environment is very important, and when the parents, they have a lot of conflict, I think they should also be mindful about what could be the effects on the children, because going online all the time, I think is the number one way today to cope with negative emotions and to what is going on at the family level. And then the other part is still social, is like the influence of peers. So we have seen that a lot of what is going online among teens is related to what other teens are doing. So also as parents being aware of where the child is and, the group of people around and what is going on also at school, I think that is also very important. So in the case there is some problem, there is also a possibility to address the problem and step up.
I have a lot of ideas, but I'm going to go before Danielle, because then she can correct me if I say something wrong. If you follow Dr. Anna Lembke, and she is the head of the Stanford Research Department for Addiction Studies, and she's got a wonderful book, Dopamine Nation, out, but she's also done some amazing podcasts, such as on the Huberman Labs podcast, Andrew Huberman. She talks a lot about this seesaw that our brain has with dopamine, and that it's a pleasure-pain seesaw, and that it has to stay in balance. And we usually have a baseline for that dopamine balance, and that seesaw can stay in balance. But if we increase pleasure, then at some point that seesaw is going to tilt the other way, and we're going to be in a state of pain, and so we're going to go right back to that pleasure-seeking behavior, whether it's, as Laura was just saying, social media, whether it's THC, cannabis, marijuana, whether it's alcohol, whether it's some sort of, pornography. We have so many addictions that are possible nowadays. But I love her description of that, because whenever that balance of pain and pleasure gets out of whack, when it gets deviated, then we seek it by continuing the pleasurable activity so that we don't go into that pain, that place of pain. Another thing she talks a lot about is boredom. And Avani Dilger, who is an expert in this area and runs a teen program for teens called Natural Highs, talks about that as well. So when we have a caveman brain that we used to have, it hasn't really developed a whole lot, at least that's what the experts I work with tell me. And so everything that comes to us now in life is really easy. It's really simple. All our survival needs are met. We're not in that state of fight, flight, or freeze anymore. And yet our brains are there. So we're very bored. And young people don't know what to do with that boredom. And what I find is the worst part is when high school starts, all of the after-school activities that they've had spending their time with and focusing their time on end, unless they're elite athletes, unless they're elite mathematicians or whatever it is. And so most parents work. Now, that's just the reality, or we're in single-family households. When they're in high school, we're not expected to be babysat, but there's no activity, there's no structure, and there's nothing going on, and then they have to deal with this boredom. And that's where something like social media, gaming, pornography, in Colorado, THC, I'm all for decriminalizing drugs. If we decriminalize them, we can regulate them. But if we don't regulate them, then we've got a monster, and THC right now out there is a monster. It's not regulated. Kids can get their hands on 90% THC strength. Do you know what we smoked when we were in college? 4% THC. Do you know what that's doing to an adolescent brain? We have more cannabis-induced psychosis in this state of kids under 25 than it's out of control. So we have to regulate drugs if we're going to decriminalize them. And boredom is a big problem. Okay.
I agree with everything you just said, Trina. And there's a reason people use drugs. There's a reason teens like social media. There's a reason people, get addicted to pornography and like watching pornography, because it all activates the reward system of our brain. And our brains evolved, just like Trina was talking about, they evolved to be attuned to reward. Because what activates the reward systems? It's things like finding a mate, right? Eating. And those are things that perpetuated the human race. So anything that activates those reward systems, our brains pay attention to and tell us to do more of. And drugs, pornography, social media, it turns out the things that are influencing, when we look at what are the causes of why do some people get addicted to pornography or get addicted to social media or gaming or drugs, we actually find the same genetic predisposition is influencing all of it, because it's related to how brains are attuned to those rewards. And so if that's what our brains want and are looking for, then we have to find other things, healthier things, to activate those same systems. And that's exactly what the folks here were talking about. What are the other things that can activate that rewarding system, and making sure that those things are in place, whether it's in families, communities, healthy peer groups, other kind of outlets like clubs or sports. Those things also activate the reward system. Now, they don't do it quite as well as drugs or even social media, because the folks who've designed all those social media apps are using all the science about how our brains love and tune into and what activates those reward systems. So we have to be aware of that and be really intentional about providing these other rewards, because otherwise they won't naturally necessarily gravitate toward it.
Thank you. I think that was a really excellent summary of protective factors and starting to move into prevention a little bit. Can you all speak a little bit more to some of the core components of treatment or prevention programs when we're thinking about addiction, whether that be social media or drugs or alcohol, gambling, other things?
Do you want to go first? I was going to say, maybe I'll jump in and I'll talk about prevention first, because it's something I'm very passionate about. I know that some others here are as well too. One of the things that I study is the underlying genetic influences, and so we know that a lot of people think that the genetics of why some people are more likely to develop problems with alcohol or other drugs or other forms of addiction is because of the way their body is going to process that drug. If I take heroin, or if I take cocaine, or if I drink alcohol, I'm more likely to become addicted to it. There's a little bit of truth to that, but most of it is about the way brains are wired. And so we know that two of the big ways that our genes influence propensity to develop addiction are things that have been talked about already here before. It's how much your brain is processed to be really tuned in to risk and reward and what's right in front of you. We sometimes call that risk-taking or impulsivity or sensation-seeking, and we all differ on it. And people who are higher on that are more likely to really like those effects of drugs. And then the other sort of genetically influenced pathway is related to this, how our brains process fear and worry, and that's more of that anxiety, proneness, depression, and using substances to cope. Okay, so if we know that's some of the things that put folks more at risk, we also know that genes aren't destiny, and since these traits or these personality factors show up early as impulsivity or maybe anxiety, sensitivity, we can then actually work on putting in place programs to help kids learn, who are more impulsive, learn self-regulation, kids who have ADHD. We know that kids who have ADHD and are medicated and have good behavioral interventions are much less likely to develop substance problems. If we work on treating the anxiety, putting in place healthy coping strategies, these are ways that we can actually reduce propensity to addiction without ever having to go to kids and be like, and now we're going to talk about substances and why you shouldn't do them and why they're dangerous. And we actually find that focusing on, hey, learn about yourself and how can you use some of these characteristics to be, as Judy was saying, your secret strength, right? Risk-taking can be a good thing. CEOs, entrepreneurs, fighter pilots are all higher on it. How can you essentially use that to accentuate the good and think about what are the ways it might lead you into challenges? And now let's put in place some things to reduce the likelihood of those challenges happening. So that's some of the new ways that we're thinking about prevention for a variety of forms of substance use and other kinds of addictions.
Can I just bring up an idea that may be a good segue back to Laura? I think that some people tolerate boredom better than others. So this dopamine pathway that you were hearing about is differently toned. And those that are kind of have a very low threshold to tolerate that are people who are more at risk because they're going to be looking for ways to jack that system. And I think because social media does it too, they're then inclined to kind of step on the pedal more and more. So smoke more weed, spend more time on the internet, because at least it's novel. At least it's not doing the dishes with my grandmother or something. So what I think that the problem is that the more we stimulate that pathway, the more insensitive it gets. It's almost like listening to music too loudly. So that's how you become deaf. And so if you like the music and you listen to it too loudly, you have to keep turning up the volume. You have to keep turning up the volume. So pretty soon you're in this trapped state where you're very easily bored if it's not, on fire, or if it's not running through your veins, or if it's not high intensity pornography. Just regular, talking to a girl in the lunchroom is not gonna do it. So I think that just recognizing that is really helpful. But I feel like, and I'm curious what the other panelists might think about this, maybe it's naive, I think one of the most challenging, risky, novel things for adolescents are other adolescents, like actual face-to-face group situations, which if I go back to when I was 13 and discovered drugs, I felt so awkward. I didn't know how to talk to people. I didn't know how to make a friend. I felt like I was always saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. That was stressful, but it was novel. And when I found alcohol and other things to kind of get the same feeling, but I could do it all by myself, in a sort of easy way. I literally thought, I have found a shortcut to growing up. So if we could recognize that and maybe build into schools social interactions. I'm not saying group therapy, but I think group therapy is kind of what I mean. It's a way to tell the truth about my little 13-year-old painful self instead of, doing bong hits by myself in the basement, or being on social media. So we really do crave interactions with other people, but those are tough.
Yeah, especially after COVID, when I was talking with high school principal, they were telling me, the kids, they don't want to come back to the school for social anxiety. They are really, they are avoiding social interaction, so that is definitely an important thing to tackle. I'm now focusing on loneliness in one of my recent projects and to see how social relationships are changing right now. But I wanted to go back about the role of prevention and the role of structured activities, as Trina, you say something about that before. And because when I'm talking with teens doing research, I remember I was in this focus group, it was in Switzerland, and they are pretty aware that at some point, we are spending too much time on the phone. And that is detrimental. And we were doing an artistic activity about, can you represent your identity, your digital identity through a mask? And some of them, they were representing the digital identity through a mask that was splitted, like in two. One was very dark, with black colors, and the other one was very colorful. In a way that they wanted to represent two parts of themselves. We have seen a lot of things and a lot of topics they were recurrent topics. And one recurrent topic was that they were kind of aware of the negative effects of spending too much time online, and the black color was representing like a void, something in which they were like losing the sense of time, and then they like a loop, like a negative loop that were going into their mind. And then I asked the question, so why don't you do something else? And you know what was the answer? The answer was because everyone else is online. Because everyone else is doing the same. And I was kind of shocked, because this is why structured activities, alternative activities promoted even by the schools, by the communities, they're so important, because it seems that there is like a social norm among young people that it's normal to be online. We are hanging out. How? Video calling each other. So we're at home with a video call of everyone else, but we are not really hanging out in person. And so we started to think about the role of structuring the time and doing some activities that are a bit more boring. So like trying to relearn how to be bored in a way that is healthy, though, because it's right. When you have such a hype through social media or through pornography or other kind of behavioral addictions that I'm talking, when you have such a hype, it's very difficult to go back to normal, gratifying behaviors. But if we want to prevent that, I think it's very important to work with young people in a way to structure the time by doing other things that are gratifying, but maybe you need to wait a little bit more to feel the gratification. If you do physical activity, you feel the gratification, but it takes some time and also some consistency in order to do that. Even with social interaction, but you need to overcome some kind of anxiety, social anxiety at the beginning, maybe fear of judgment, but then the gratification that you have is healthier and long-lasting. And I think that, yeah, like trying to build on that a bit more and being aware with the youngest ones, I think it's very important for prevention right now.
So I'm going to jump into a little bit of treatment, if that's okay, because we talked a lot about prevention. But I do want to say, when we provide these presentations in classrooms, one of the things that we get a lot of feedback from students, and we get feedback from all of these students that we present in front of, is how important the brain chemistry presentation was. Everyone looks at addiction as a moral failure, as a mistake, as you made bad choices, and then you chose this. And when people understand that this has to do with what's happening in their brain, rather than them being able to control their actions, it changes the whole dynamic. And then people can accept treatment. So what we're really trying to do by opening these conversations up and showing what's happening in the brain is destigmatize what's happening to people. And when they're not ashamed, and when they don't feel ashamed, and when they're not considered moral failures, then they can ask for help, and then they can accept treatment. So it's a very important piece of this, besides identifying where fentanyl is and what drugs it's in, and how to stay alive, and how not to use recreational drugs and die the first time you do, which is part of our educational prevention program. The other thing is there's an amazing program that Avani Dilger has put together called Turn Your Anxiety into Your Superpower. I can't tell you how many kids in our state are diagnosed with anxiety. Do you know anxiety is a normal condition, at least in the schools of thought that I study? And yet our kids fear it, and it's become something that is very detrimental. But I have so many kids, probably 30% of the kids we present to tell me, well, I've been diagnosed with anxiety. I think we have to change the way we look at our emotions. And what Avani has developed is this amazing training for teachers and for students on how to channel that anxiety into positive energy and into your superpower, and to stop being so afraid of it, and to stop medicating it so much, because we have a lot of medications that temper anxiety, but then we can't feel our emotions either. My daughter and I also provide a program called CRAFT, Community Reinforcement and Family Training. It's a 12-week curriculum. It's evidence-based. The Behavioral Health Administration of Colorado provides a grant for that. We've trained over 700 now parents in Boulder County in the state of Colorado in this. All of them have a child of any age struggling with a substance use disorder. And this uses positive communication skills. It uses a harm reduction model, but it uses connection with your child to try to influence them, but also rebuild trust and rebuild a relationship. And when you can rebuild that trust and relationship, you can start to influence them towards seeking other alternatives and getting help and seeking treatment. And it really works.
All sound like really incredible programs and strategies, and I think in hearing what all of you are describing, for me as a clinical psychologist, I'm thinking about like tolerating distress, tolerating boredom, tolerating anxiety, and trying to understand that this is all part of life, right? And how do we teach people from a very early age? We know that this early intervention time point is super important to really have those kinds of skills and then be able to seek support when they need it. We have gotten a lot of amazing questions, so I'm going to switch over to questions from the audience. We're not going to have time to get through all of them, but we'll start to work through a few of them, so thank you all. The first question that I have here is, how does an individual recognize when they have a problem?
I'll just say, I think when the costs of your choices outweigh the benefits, then it's irrational.
I'll add one of the challenges is that drugs also change the brain, as we have been talking about. And so sometimes that can make it hard for an individual to realize that their life is being adversely affected. And the way we diagnose substance use disorders is really by, is this causing harm in your life in a variety of ways? And it's kind of arbitrary, right? We sort of draw this line as to when we're going to call it a clinical disorder versus just risky use or something. And I mentioned the fact that the drugs actually change the brain. And Trina talked about cannabis, and it's one of the things that I too am really worried about because we don't have good research on it. It is a highly potent drug. The place where we see it having huge impacts is, we can see it in animal studies, which is what we can do right now, and we see it in emergency departments. And it affects memory and motivation. And the motivation, the unfortunate piece is that oftentimes individuals who are using alcohol in ways that are harmful at some point will realize this is having a lot of adverse effects on my life. We used to talk about hitting rock bottom. I mean, now we think about this is somebody who has, in an earlier panel, I talked to someone about, is it a disease or a disorder? I think this is someone who has a condition that's going on in their brain that's causing harm to their life. And so if you have a loved one that's struggling, helping them and helping them realize it, rather than, well, they need to hit rock bottom, we know that's not the case. You can get individuals into treatment and they can be helped, even when they're not, always excited to be going, essentially. With cannabis, one of the nefarious things about the drug is that your life can be falling apart and you also don't care. That's a side effect of really heavy use. And I mention that because a lot of people gasped when Trina was talking about how potent this drug is. They don't realize that this is what is going on sometimes, and especially if it's youth, it's like, God, they don't care anymore. Youth these days, it's so hard. That's really a symptom that they could be in an active stage of addiction and having problems. And so helping support them and getting them into treatment is really important.
I'm going to combine two questions, so you could sort of choose to answer both of them or one or the other. But somebody asks, is there an age where experimenting with alcohol and other drugs is relatively safe? And maybe sort of related, what do you say to parents or adults who allow alcohol use or other substances in the home because they're going to do it anyway, in quotes? Do you let them do it in a safe space?
I think about 90% of people who develop a problem start using before they're 18. And the earlier they start using, the more likely it is. So I would say the safe age is about 26, when the brain is fully mature. And I said to my kids, and I say it to my students, think about it. You can really enjoy drugs if you can just wait. And of course, none of them do, because they're also when they're younger, more likely to take risks, more likely to encounter things in the school and all that. Yeah, I'd say that.
Yeah, research shows, and Danielle and Judy are probably the experts on this, but the younger you start, the higher the risk and the higher your rate of addiction is. Sorry, whoops.
It was using at home, yeah. If you drink a glass of wine with your parents over a meal in an hour, it won't even reach your brain, so that would be okay. If you're intoxicated at home, it's as risky as being intoxicated somewhere else.
And I think it depends again on the brain and the genetics. I mean, my son had no interest when he might have a glass of wine at a holiday because there was wine around. My daughter would be guzzling it, two different people, two different brains, same parents.
There's really compelling national data that the longer you wait, the better it is in terms of the reduced likelihood of developing problems. That if you look at people who start using alcohol at 13 or younger, 50% of them go on to develop problems. It drops off in a linear fashion, such that if you look at folks who wait until they're 21 or older, legal drinking age, it's about 10%, which is the population average of about how many folks go on to develop a severe substance use disorder. And there is new data showing that any amounts of alcohol are not healthy for us. Unfortunately, that idea that a glass of wine at night was going to be good for our heart or whatnot, it's now clear that alcohol is not good for our health. That said, we all make choices about what amount of risk we're willing to take. And it's very clear that once your brain is fully developed, using in moderate quantities is, provided you don't have other health conditions and whatnot, is not nearly as detrimental as when you're younger. I really quickly want to take on this question because I get asked it all the time by parents about, they're going to do it anyway, so should we let them use at home? It would be safer. And the related question is what I sometimes call the European myth, which is, look at Europe. They let them drink at home with their parents, and so they teach them to use responsibly. Isn't that better than the way we have it in the United States? And it turns out that actually the highest rates of risky substance use among youth are in Europe, where there is more drinking at home also with the family, and there are lower drinking age limits, because they might be responsibly having a glass of wine at home with their parents, but they are not responsibly having a glass of wine when they are out with all of their peers. And I also want to push back a little bit on this idea that they're going to do it anyway, because I think we need to be very careful about the messages we do send to our kids. It turns out that the rates of alcohol use have been dropping steadily for the last few decades, and they are at the lowest they have ever been. And it's not simply a swap out for other drugs either. Unfortunately, cannabis is going up, and that's problematic for the reasons we've talked about, but it's not a one-to-one swap out. Our kids are actually making healthier choices than we did when we were their age. And so I think to assume or to give them the message, consciously or unconsciously, like, well, they're going to do it anyway, that's not necessarily true. So we want to think about what kind of messages we're giving our kids surrounding substance use and whether or not we accept that in young kids as parents or as other guardians.
Great. Okay. This question is about access, which is something we haven't totally touched on yet. So I think it's a great point. And specifically for Trina, How do we keep dentists and surgeons from prescribing post-surgical opiates automatically? My daughter had her wisdom teeth out and we said no opiates, and they still sent her home with a prescription. So I guess questions about that specifically, and maybe like broader issues around access.
So in Colorado, I think it was 4 years ago, and I testified for this law, and so did my daughter. We passed a law that supposedly prohibits physicians from prescribing more than 7 days of an opioid without reevaluating and having to rewrite a new prescription, so that limits how accessible opioid prescriptions are. I have asked in all of the classrooms in the last year and a half how many people have been prescribed opioids with wisdom teeth being removed, and very few hands are going up now, whereas they used to all go up. I'm really surprised and I'm really disappointed that that happened to you with your daughter, because we now have choices, and we have orthodontists and surgeons who will not prescribe opioids, and if you requested it, I want to almost say you should report that physician, that dentist. That's really not okay. My best friend in Steamboat lost her son to an overdose because he was in a bad accident, had a head injury, and he was overprescribed prescriptions. The parents begged them not to prescribe opioids because they knew he had been addicted to them before, and they ignored them, and they prescribed him at 19 years old, and he ended up overdosing at home. This is not okay as far as I'm concerned.
This person's asking about what role does isolation and escapism play in driving addiction risk?
You go.
Oh, maybe I can talk a little bit about, for example, online gaming and internet addiction. So we know that, it plays a huge role. So we know some people, they just isolate themselves to stay on the internet. I can imagine some of you have heard about the term hikikomori. So people that are just, it's kind of a social anorexia, these people that are completely isolated from the social world and spend their life like in a room, mostly on the internet and mostly playing. And so, that is definitely a very important ingredient to consider. And again, it's related to avoidance of relationships, avoidance of dealing with maybe tough life choices, and in general not having any kind of support around to rely on. So that is definitely a huge risk factor for sure.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think we've all talked about, in one way or another, that using is kind of benefits from being isolated. So the addictive use of anything kind of depends on being alone, and then it makes us more alienated further. So it is kind of a cycle. And somebody said something earlier. I was reminded when my daughter was in high school. She was busy on the internet, and she was also, I learned, drinking a little more than I knew. And she was kind of miserable. I don't know how many people have raised a high school student lately, but I didn't really like her, and she definitely didn't like me. And I can remember distinctly, what would happen is she'd come home and she'd go in her room, and I'd want to go in my room and close the door too, And I had a friend who knew more about treatment than I did, and she said, just be with her. So I said, we're going to sit in the living room. You can do what you want, and I can do what I want, but we're going to sit here together. And boy, she was mad, I don't want to, I got, why do I have to? Well, we did it day after day after day, and much to my surprise, one day she said, you wouldn't believe what happened at school today. And then, 2 days later, she said, look at this that I just found on the internet. Do you think this is cute or something? So I think that addiction depends on alienation, and recovery or even prevention is really benefited by connections. And it's hard work these days. We have a society that is basically made to keep us isolated. Yeah.
This question is, do you think Ozempic and similar new drugs will help address addiction in any way?
Oh, I'm really excited you asked this question. So I've been following this pretty closely, and I think that there's also, if you're interested, a Substack group called Recursive Adaptation. It's a nonprofit group, and it's started by a young guy who kind of comes out of tech and community, leadership and whatnot, who has had individuals close to him who have struggled with addiction, and is really assembling all the literature surrounding this. So I think it's early days, but I think there's very compelling evidence that the way that these drugs operate appear to be on kind of what I talked a little bit about, how genetic influences are broad, and so they're not specific to any one substance. They're impacting all these sorts of different types of addiction. And Ozempic appears to kind of reduce that noise that can exist in our head surrounding compulsive eating, which, by the way, these genetic predispositions also influence compulsive eating, compulsive drug taking, acting out in kids, behavioral problems. So there's a biological connection between all of these things related to craving, and compulsive behavior. And it appears that it reduces, and anecdotally, people talk about it reduces the food noise, and that's why they just don't feel compelled or the desire to eat a lot. And in psychiatry, people are talking about it also just reduces the interest or craving, that kind of noise in your head that's like, oh, maybe I should have a drink, or, I always have a drink when I come home from work, and that just kind of exists in the brain. So I actually think it's extremely promising. The biggest challenge is that the pharmaceutical industry abandoned addiction and psychiatry a decade plus ago. It's very hard and very expensive to develop these drugs, and they now have drugs that are Ozempic and whatnot. This is their golden child. These are the cash cows. They are aware that they might be also very useful in treating substance use disorders. And you would think, a new market, great. You have to run certain types of clinical trials to get these drugs approved, and they have, from off the record conversations that I know people have had with a lot of these large drug companies, they don't have any interest in this because it's very hard to run clinical trials with patients with substance use disorders. They have a lot of challenges in their lives. They have a lot of other mental health conditions. A single person commits suicide, maybe for totally unrelated reasons. They don't want a black box warning on their cash cow drugs, so anytime a doctor goes to prescribe it for diabetes or obesity, it's now going to have a suicide warning label on it. So they've not been very interested. So it's going to take a groundswell of people saying addiction is a crisis. There is growing scientific evidence, and assuming it does continue to mount, that this is an effective treatment, and we need emergency breakthrough designations and things to be able to use them, because they're so expensive that though doctors are even starting to prescribe them off-label, insurance won't cover that, and so it will be inaccessible to many people who have substance use disorders. And the last challenge is that the FDA uses abstinence and a really high definition of no use at all as its outcome measure for approving drugs related to substance use disorder. This does not at all match with harm reduction efforts and the fact that we know reducing substance use can have huge implications. And some people, they don't want to stop using altogether. They just want to reduce their use, and that would be very beneficial for health, but that's not what the FDA uses to approve drugs. And because the pharmaceutical industry hasn't been pursuing drugs related to substance use disorders, there's been no pressure on the FDA to change those really unreasonable outcomes to approve drugs. So we've really been stuck in this cycle, which has led us to now, which is only having 4 approved drugs to treat substance use disorders, this huge national crisis that's taking so many lives. So I think there's great promise here, but it's going to take a lot of people being aware of this to start speaking out to actually make progress in getting this to people who it could benefit.
Thank you so much. We are just about at time. So just want to thank you all so much for your insights and your knowledge and for sharing with this group. I learned so much and definitely got my wheels turning. So many thanks.